which means nobody at home will be able to see me. I'll wait to sit down here real quick. So I'll turn myself on. So no, you don't need to. Thank you. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I do work now. I can hear myself now. It is good to be with you tonight. I'm going to start a little bit. We are on Spirit of Joy time, and we have a few people who are not Spirit of Joy people here. I told that to somebody once who was a real stickler for time. He was complaining because we started late, and I said, we're on Spirit of Joy time. And then another person, I said we're on God's time. He said we're on Spirit of Joy's time. And then someone else was there and said, I thought they were the same thing. So anyway, we are on God's time. We are starting. Did anyone order a book that's here? All right. Most of them are back here on this side. And I may have one or two extra here. Anybody else need a book here? Excuse me. There you go. All right. So I'm actually recording what we are doing tonight for a very important purpose. The more I looked at this, the more that I realized that if we don't set our foundations, we're going to be talking past each other. How many of you have noticed that the world is a little divided nowadays? And it divides particularly around politics. And when we begin to talk about things in culture, culture and politics overlap. And so if we don't set our foundations properly, even very good Christian people may feel like they're in conflict because we're talking about politics which are divisive. And we don't want to do that. We want to go to somewhere more important. And so as we begin tonight, that's what I want to do. I want to set the foundations. We're going to start by covering Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. And as we do that, it'll become clear why we are starting this way and looking into all of this. Now, as we begin to do this, what you will find is that at the heart of everything is Christ's call to us. And then his model for how to live based on that. And how many of you have ever, in any kind of way, wanted to change or transform our world? We all want to do that, don't we? All right? How many people, when we think the people that change our world, we think of people with big names that have made huge impacts. Well, if every Christian made a small impact where they're at, big changes would occur. And that is what is at the heart of the Benedict option. So I'm kind of stalling for a minute or two before I get deeply into things because I'm hoping a few more people come in because we have about 30 people signed up for this. But I know a lot are out of town tonight, so we say hello, and I'm going to encourage everybody to please go back and watch this, those who are out of town. Because like I said, and you'll see why in a few minutes, but if we're not on the same page, we're going to talk past each other. But I see this as incredibly important. So let me start with a word from Scripture. Colossians 2, verse 8. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the universe, and not according to Christ. And then Dreher begins his book with these words from the Rule of St. Benedict. He says, "Let us arise then, at last, for the Scripture stirs us up, saying, now is the hour for us to rise from sleep." That's Romans 13. So, now is what? It's the hour. It's the time for us to rise from sleep. So, Dreher begins his book, and I'm going to kind of summarize the beginning. I haven't asked you to read anything yet. I'm going to summarize the beginning. But in one of his, maybe his first chapter, he says, no one saw the great flood coming. And he tells the story about, he says, I live in southern Louisiana near Baton Rouge. He said the weatherman called for like 6 inches of rain in the next 5 days. In 2 days, we had 30 inches of rain. It was a 1,000-year flood, which means every 1,000 years an event like that will take place. But no one anticipated it. He said what you begin to find was, he says in southern Louisiana, when there's a disaster, people, like a flood, people do one of two things. Either they get out their own little John boats and they become the Cajun Navy. They go around to little homes and they rescue people who are stranded. Or they go to the community shelters. He said in southern Louisiana, we always make jambalaya and we listen to people tell their stories. And he said over and over again, what you begin to find were people who would be saying things like, it's never flooded where we've lived. We never thought it would ever happen to us. How did this happen? Suddenly, everything in our lives changed. Mary Louise and I saw that. Any kind of natural disasters that you've been around. First community where I was a pastor, we had a forest fire suddenly come into town. It'd been just sitting out there for days, and all of a sudden the wind shifted. It barreled into town, and 400 of the 6,000 homes were burned to the ground. We never saw it coming. He goes on to say, that's the way many people now are looking at culture. Okay? We might have seen little signs. We might have heard some prophetic weatherman saying, oh, things are going to get worse. They're going to change. This is going to happen. But mostly we don't listen to that. We just think, it's just going to keep going on. Kind of how it is all along. And all of a sudden, how many of you have felt like in the last 5, 6, 8 years, you've kind of looked up and it's like something dramatic has changed. And I can't describe it exactly. I can't say how and when and where, but something has changed. And I heard a few people in our groups that are parents saying, this has kind of been a hard thing. It's like, I'm afraid for my children and the world they're going to grow up in. For some of us, it's grandchildren. I'm afraid for my grandchildren and the world they're growing up in. So he starts with that image of the flood. And he goes on to say, we Christians in the West are facing our own 1,000-year flood. Or if you believe Pope Emeritus Benedict the 16th, a 1,500-year flood. In 2012, the then pontiff said that the spiritual crisis overtaking the West is the most serious since the fall of the Roman Empire near the end of the 5th century. The light of Christianity is flickering out all over the West. By God's mercy, the faith may continue to flourish in the global South and in places like China, but barring a dramatic reversal of current trends, it will all but disappear entirely from Europe and North America. That's where we're headed. He says, this may not be the end of the world, but it is the end of a world. And only the willfully blind will continue, would deny it. So, I want to go back to what the 21st century Pope named Benedict said to start our study of essentially a 7th century monk named Benedict. Pope Benedict said, the spiritual crisis overtaking the West is the most serious since the fall of the Roman Empire. Rod Dreher says, but don't worry, the church has been here before. And so then he turns to the story of Benedict. And essentially, the way that he tells the story, what he winds up saying is that, in essence, Saint Benedict wound up saving the church, and in many ways, saving the West. Okay? So here's the story of Benedict. And if a few of you on the back row can give our new folks here paper as they come in and join us here. So as they get settled, I'll tell the story of Benedict here. Benedict grew up as a nice little Catholic boy in northern Italy around the year 600 AD. And he was so excited because he always wanted to go to the church's Mecca, which was Rome. You know, he'd heard such great things about all that had come out of Rome over the years. He couldn't wait to get to Rome, to see whatever existed of the Vatican back then. I don't know which churches or buildings were there at the time, but he couldn't wait to go. And by the time he got to Rome, Rome had already been sacked. And there were a new group of, what was it, the Visigoths or something? They were there, they were controlling it. They were essentially managing a slow decline of the Roman Empire. They kept up just enough, but they didn't have any philosophical roots or foundations. And when Benedict went there, he was so disgusted that he fled. He went out into the wilderness for a few years, and then he literally went and lived in a cave because he was so disgusted. How could this happen to our world? How could this happen to our church? When Benedict finally emerged from the cave, he wound up starting. One of the first things was they essentially preserved literacy, not only of the Bible, which was the focal point, but they're managing a decline. They're in free fall. Nobody's teaching in schools. Well, you need to learn to read. No, they're just surviving day by day. And so they begin teaching people how to read. And how do you learn to read? But you start with the Bible. And so they taught biblical knowledge and they taught literacy. They had to survive somehow as a monastery. And so they became farmers. Well, farming had essentially gone out the window. Nobody knew how to farm anymore because they were so oppressed by this ruling nation. And I was talking to a church history guy today, and the church history guy said, oh yeah, I know that about Benedict. He said people would have the Benedictines all over the country to teach them how to farm again. They saved, in many ways, the West. And what happened in these Benedictine monasteries was they taught a way of life that worked. And they wound up doing great things. Now, we asked the question earlier, who wouldn't like to make a positive impact on the world? Okay? Benedict was just one regular guy. He started a little house of prayer, and he wound up saving the West. Okay? If you take God out of the equation, the human Jesus was just one ordinary guy who called 12 ordinary guys to come walk with him. And he wound up changing the world. Now, we all know that there was a power behind what Jesus did and what Benedict did. But it starts from ordinary people doing ordinary things. And great things can wind up happening in our world. So, why is this week going to be a little different than every other week? Today, and I told you a little bit this in the beginning, we had a few more people come in. We're starting with the basic premises for how we're going to talk about all of this. Because if we don't have that foundation, we're going to talk past each other and not get to anything practical. So, I'm going to ask you to turn to the sheet that I gave you. And on the sheet that I gave you, essentially are a bunch of icons that are going to help us talk about what we are studying. So I want you to take a look at the first one. Everybody see the river that's there? Okay. Now, how many of you have ever heard, one of my favorite places for podcasts and content in terms of worldview is the Colson Center. Many people know Chuck Colson. Chuck Colson years ago was a Watergate guy. He fell with Nixon, came to faith in the midst of all of that, came out and started a prison ministry because he'd been to prison now. And he saw how poorly prisoners were treated. But it was his passion. And he was convinced that the way you change a country from crime is not just by changing prison rules. You've got to start back a lot further. And you've got to introduce people to something bigger than themselves, bigger than usually the brokenness they grew up with. And so Colson became one of the huge influential figures in Christianity at the end of the 20th century. So he passed away a few years ago, but the Colson Center is still prominent. And one thing Chuck Colson used to tell his people is that politics are downstream from culture. What that means is, if you want to know what and why is happening in politics, don't look at the politics. Look at the culture. Okay? A simple example. I would bet there are a few people in this room who loved Donald Trump, stood up for conservative values or whatever. I bet there are a few people in this room that hated Donald Trump with a passion. Okay? And that's neither here nor there, but isn't it interesting that in our generation, America chose a reality TV star, culture, as our president? Isn't that interesting? Politics are downstream from culture. It's not new. Back in the 60s, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy debated. It was one of the first presidential debates ever televised. Kennedy took the advice of people and wore makeup. Nixon did not. Nixon looked like this dark, angry man on television. Anybody that watched it said Kennedy was amazing. Anybody that listened said Nixon demolished Kennedy in the debate. Okay? The power of culture and media that we have. So if you're filling in blanks here, number 4 at the top, pointing to near the end of the river, is politics. And what is politics based on? What's that little word under it? Power. Okay? Number 3 then is culture, because politics are downstream from culture. And culture is based on what? Influence. So I hadn't paid much attention to this, but there are such a thing as social media influencers. People make millions of dollars just going on social media and, showing what to wear and how hip and cool they are. They tell you in gentle ways how you can be more hip and cool. They influence. I've talked to people who truly work with youth, and they say, who do the kids listen to? They don't listen to mom and dad. They don't listen to teachers. They listen to the influencers on social media. Culture is influence. Politics is power. But there's something further upstream that we need to pay attention to. And number 1 here, the first thing is, behind all of this is, and we're going to call it worldview. All right? So you can write that word in there. Now, I will tell you quite honestly, I have a Christian worldview. It is shaped by Scripture. It is shaped by what God says to me through His Word. Are there other worldviews operative in our culture right now? Okay? For example, there is a secular worldview. And its starting point, our starting point, is God. The secular worldview is not God. It's humanity. And we get to very different places. But in back of our culture is whatever we ultimately believe in. And so at the headwaters is whatever our worldview is. Okay, so you can put religion in there, you can put, but it's worldview somehow. So, and it is the foundation of everything. But here is where the Benedict option talks about. It is not going to talk about politics. It is not, it has to mention it occasionally, and it's not going to talk about culture, although it has to mention it occasionally, because we all live in the culture, we're all affected by the politics. But where Rod Dreher says that we need to focus on as God's people is this second step, which are things like neighborhood, church, and family. That's where we are to focus. Okay? And so if we're focusing on neighborhood, church, and family, what is behind all of those interactions? It's relationships, right? This is where we have the influence. It's not through culture, it's through the relationships. If we want to change the world, the church needs to work with the people around them, wherever it's at. It could be your workplace, it could be your neighborhood, it could be, and as we go further and further into this book, he's going to give you practical stories and examples of how maybe you could make an impact in your place. Okay? So that is the difference. It's either power, influence, or relationships. And he is calling us to relational ministry. Okay? Now, politics. We need to discuss that for just a minute, because if you open up this book, some of you may get hit with what you think is immediately politics. Okay? Because our world trains us to see everything through that lens. Just as an honest commentary, how many of you this week have spent more time listening to the news and politics than you have spent reading about Scripture or listening to Christian books or podcasts? Most of us do that, don't we? All right? The world has trained us to look this way. And so in the Benedict option, he is not talking about politics, but it's going to seem like that at moments. And so let me give you an example, because if you start reading this and he's going to tell you, I'm a conservative Christian, all right? And you're going to go, conservative Christian. If you're a liberal, conservative Christian, he has conservative politics, it's all about politics. And so he says, don't be fooled. This is in one of the first pages. The upset presidential victory of Donald Trump has at best given us a bit more time to prepare for the inevitable flood. Okay? Here's what he's saying in that. You can tell he wrote the entire book before the election. I read an article, I was looking stuff up preparing for this. He was absolutely terrified of a Hillary Clinton presidency. The reason why was one of Clinton's key platforms was freedom of worship, not freedom of religion, which meant you can do whatever you want in your place, but don't you dare bring it out in public. Even though the administration she'd just been part of was suing people like the Little Sisters of the Poor for doing what they did within their walls. Clinton, one of her primary platforms was trying to undo religious liberty. Now, in this article I read just before the election, he was equally terrified of a Trump presidency, and for completely different reasons. He was convinced that Trump was going to lead us into every war across the globe, and he was terrified of, essentially said, this big buffoon of a man who was running for president. So he was terrified about this election. I know many of you probably, looking at that election 4 years ago, I won't make you raise your hand, but did anybody hold their nose and pull the ballot for one of the other? That's what a lot of Christians wound up doing, okay? Now, he says, don't be fooled, the upset presidential victory of Donald Trump has at best given us a bit more time to prepare for the inevitable. What he's saying is Trump won't fight against religious freedom, which Clinton was signaling that was going to be one of her primary goals, okay? So if you start reading this, what I'm trying to say is this is not about politics. Even though you may read the word Donald Trump, and if you're triggered by the word Trump on the first pages, you may go, this is not about politics. And here's an actual quote from Rod Dreher. Here's how to get started with the anti-political nature of the Benedict option, okay? And as I read each of these, tell me which number on those icons we're at, okay? See if these are about politics, which is number 4. See if it's culture, which is number 3. Or see if it is relationships, neighborhood, church, and family, which is 2. So here's how to get started with the anti-political nature of the Benedict option. Secede culturally from the mainstream. Which one are we at? 2. No, secede from the culture. Okay? Turn off the television. Okay? Put the smartphones away, because we search for the wrong things. Read books, play games, make music, feast with your friends. You hear the relational nature? It's not enough to avoid what is bad. You must also embrace what is good. Start a church or a group within your church. Open a classical Christian school or join and strengthen one that exists. Plant a garden and participate in a local farmer's market. Teach kids how to play music, relational, and start a band. Join the volunteer fire department. The point is not that we should stop voting or being active in conventional politics. The point, rather, is that this is no longer enough. Okay? Now, have I made that point clear that this is not about politics? Okay? Because if we get into politics, we're going to be divided. We got to go back further. Okay. So, if you're reading it in the beginning, if he says conservative Christian, avoid the knee-jerk reaction if that's not you. Simply, what does conservative mean? It's conserving what is old and traditional. Okay? Progressive, by definition, this is not politics, is progressing beyond what is traditional. So when he says conservative, he's talking about we're going back to conserve what is traditional. So he also uses the word traditional Christian. But most of all, and here he says, most of all, I will use the word orthodox, small o, to refer to theologically traditional Protestants, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox Christians. So, did I make that point clear? It's not about politics. All right? So, diagnosis. He diagnoses several problems. And then I sent out emails to you, and probably 15 people responded. And I'm going to get to those in just a minute, but here are some of his diagnoses to the problems that are in our culture. We are consumeristic. He says we're watching the millennial generation essentially abandon the church in unprecedented numbers. Okay? So we have the boomers, we have Gen X, we have the millennials. And it only takes one generation for the church to die. The millennials are abandoning the church. Who's teaching the next generation? All right? He says 1 in 3 18 to 29-year-olds have put religion aside completely if they ever picked it up in the first place. If the demographic trends continue, our churches will soon be empty. Even more troubling, many of the churches that do stay open will have been hollowed out by a sneaky kind of secularism to the point where the Christianity taught there is devoid of life and power. So one why, he goes on to discuss what he's going to call moral therapeutic deism. In 2005, Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist Denton did a survey of American Christians. And they found that American Christianity could be defined as moral therapeutic deism. Moral, what's the purpose of religion? Be good. Therapeutic, what's the purpose of religion? Make you feel good. Deist, who is God? Essentially, he is not an active God that speaks and has any power in your daily life. He is a distant God that we should acknowledge, but not one that we should really know or obey. Be good, feel good. He's kind of up there. That's American cultural Christianity, and no wonder the next generation didn't pick it up. Okay? So, he goes on to talk about the loss of traditional Christian values. Has anybody been concerned about this as we look at our world? Okay. He says, not only have traditional Christian values been routed, even in Supreme Court cases, but those espousing traditional values are increasingly called racists, homophobes, and evil. So he was writing this about 5 years ago. Has that increased or decreased since then? Here's a quote. The cultural war that began with the sexual revolution in the 1960s has now ended in defeat for the Christian conservatives. The cultural left, which is to say, increasingly the American mainstream, has no intention of living in post-war peace. It is pressing forward with a harsh, relentless occupation, one that is aided by the cluelessness of Christians who don't understand what is happening. The flood has come. We didn't see it. We don't know what's going on. We are suddenly upside down. So everything is changing so fast. He goes on to say, for a long time we have downplayed or ignored the signs, but now the floodwaters are upon us, and we are not ready. The storm clouds have been gathering for decades, but most of us believers have operated under the illusion that they would blow over. The breakdown of the natural family, the loss of traditional moral values, the fragmenting of communities, we were troubled by these developments, but believed they were reversible. The changes that have overtaken the West in modern times have revolutionized everything, even the church, which no longer forms souls, but caters to selves. So, I want you to take a look at the other side. I have the icons on one side and the other side of your sheet here. And on one side, these are a list of things that you put down as deeply concerning to you. And I put the number of votes essentially beside it. This is what people said. So 4 people, just like Rod Dreher just talked about, was moral decline. And I want to give you the Christian worldview behind this. And so I kind of want to say every one of these is I grieve, or we grieve, the moral decline in our life. Isn't that where we're at? We grieve the moral decline in our world because God has a different plan. God outlines a way of life that works. Going against godly instruction is wise at best and evil at worst. Okay, we're back to the Christian worldview. We're not talking about culture. We're not talking about politics. We're talking about our foundation, right? God has a way that works. And when we ignore it, it's unwise at best. It's evil at worst. Does that make sense? Okay? And someone here said, because we don't acknowledge truth and remove biblical principles from society, that's why it's happening. And it's scary for us parents. Okay. Other thing that he said, remember how he said, even the churches that are operating so often focus on the self, how to make my life better. Okay. Self-orientation is another thing that we said was so important. In Genesis 3, for example, describes one of the first sins, which is self-focus, self-glorification, wanting to be like God. When it's about us, we are training people to be like God. It's all about you. That was the radical thing that started Rick Warren's purpose-driven life. Anybody remember the first sentence? It's not about you. Okay. A couple more. And keep going down here. Identity crisis. I love the way one person put this. The worldview, we grieve the identity crisis in this world. People no longer know who they are because they don't know whose they are. Okay? We all belong to God. If we don't know whose we are, children of God, we don't know who we are. And no wonder our culture is adrift. Okay? Now, the next one down is a lack of unity and division in our society. God wants Christians to be one, as the Father and the Son are one. But we are not to be one with culture. We are to be separated from culture and be one with God and our brothers and sisters. People lamented the tribalism that we're finding in our modern culture, the mob mentality, the deep growing divide between left and right, They're lamenting and grieving that we're treating others as if they were at the extremes. If you don't agree with me, you're an extremist. Okay? And the inflammatory labeling of others. I read an article from one of my favorite website Got Questions that said, in modern communication, it's common to attack opposing views using the most provocative language possible. Terms like hate speech, radical, fascist, racist, supremacist, communist, nationalist, and traitor are applied to views that don't reasonably fit those definitions. You take the classical definition, it doesn't fit. But yet we're calling people racist. We're calling people haters. We're calling people, okay? They go on to say they're grieved by the willful refusal to listen to both sides of the news. I always encourage people, listen to a liberal site and a conservative site, and maybe you'll get to the truth. If they both agree, which isn't very often, that's probably true. There's a lack of nuanced thinking, a lack of willingness to wrestle through issues, and we're not living out tangible love and respect. Isn't that interesting? Truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He says, know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But if you noticed in our culture, a denial. These are y'all's voices. A denial of objective reality and a denial of absolute truth. How many times are we asked to trade truths for lies? There's a lack of desire for factual accuracy, especially in politics. There's a lack of objectivity in the press. There's intentional subversion of definitions of marriage, family, gender, etc. Even churches are failing to use the Bible as the standard. There's a lack of truth in the church. Okay? Freedom of speech. Okay? God desires freedom. He wants us to be able to proclaim his name. Curtailing free speech is curtailing the gospel. Okay? And hey, we all know that there is negative free speech. I'm old enough to remember when the Nazis were marching in Skokie, Illinois. And the ACLU stood up and said, no, they need the right to do that, because if we destroy the free speech of anyone, we destroy it for us all. Okay? Is free speech being curtailed nowadays? Yes. Cancel culture destroys the freedom of speech. Disagreement is automatically registered as hate speech. There's judgment if you don't follow the correct agenda. These are all y'all's words. Okay? Freedom of religion. Suppressing of God and religion is unholy. We're suppressing that. I had someone that talked to me and said, we all know that Christianity thrives better under persecution. And so why are we concerned about freedom of religion dying? Because the church may actually be better off. I mean, it's better off in China where there's, but it's like, I'd rather pray for revival than persecution. I'd rather have the ability to proclaim the good news and meet as a community out in the open. And the loss of any freedom is like dominoes that will be the loss of every freedom, which is totalitarianism. Okay? Here's another one. Racial issues. How many of you in this past year have grieved where we've been at in terms of the racial issues in this nation? One of the ways to think about God's perspective on this, Mary Louise introduced me to a writer named John Perkins. He was a sharecropper when he was growing up back in Mississippi. His mom died because there was not adequate medical care for African Americans in those days. His brother, when he got home from fighting the war, was killed, murdered by a policeman in a racial dispute. John Perkins, as a young man, wound up in prison where he was beaten savagely. He wanted, these are essentially his testimony, he wanted to hate white people. He said he went into the hospitals because he was beaten so badly. And there were white doctors and nurses who, in spite of his hatred, were kind. And God spoke into his heart that hatred was not the answer, but reconciliation. And John Perkins talks about how there are not multiple races. There's one race, the human race. And what he goes on to say, now there are many nations. And if you look on the other side of your piece of paper, I love that picture that our missionaries gave us, that at Jesus, essentially at a Last Supper kind of image. And here he is with people from every tribe and language, those words from Revelation that are so powerful. We are all made in the image of God. That's the worldview. That is what is at the back of everything that's here. And yet we also need to know that part of the worldview is that oppression in any form is evil. Absolute evil. Okay? And so we have people, and if we were dividing into sides, we have people that are said in the responses to me that critical race theory and the negative aspects of Black Lives Matter are hugely concerning. And on the other side, we have people that were saying that white supremacy, subtle and blatant, is one of the greatest problems in our nation. And so if we were dividing lines, we put those on opposite sides. But we're trying not to divide lines. So no issue is going to be divisive for us, as divisive for us in our culture as perhaps this one. There's been the pendulum of sentiment around this issue has been swinging like crazy, hasn't it? People on both sides. And I want, you can take a look at the pendulum in there. And I want to give you an example of how theologically that pendulum swings and works. Martin Luther is a good example. Martin Luther grew up in a time when the only way to be saved was through your works. And Martin Luther, and you've heard me say this many times, opened the Word and discovered God's grace. That we are saved by grace, Romans 3, apart from works prescribed by the law. By God's grace. Right? So it's not our works that save us. And so Martin Luther grew up in a time when the pendulum was off-center. It was way up here. And he had to swing that pendulum hard to break things out. And sometimes he swung it a little past center. The next generation took it way past center. The generation after Luther was essentially going around saying, to prove that we're not saved by works, we need to live corrupt lives so that people will know that we are trusting in grace. Okay? The center was here. We are justified by God's grace, effective through faith, apart from works. They started here, they swung it over there. You see how the pendulum works? If you look at that pendulum, if the goal is the center, look at those numbers on that pendulum on that other side of the diagram. Where is it the least often? In the center. It's slowing down as it gets up here, and then it starts gathering momentum, and then it swoops past, and then it's slow. And the pendulum is most always at the extremes, not the center. Okay? So, Where should the pendulum be? The center. Where is it least? The center. And I want to tell you that I believe that Martin Luther King Jr. centered the pendulum. Okay? Remember his most famous phrase, I have a dream that people will one day be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Does that agree with everything that Scripture says? Absolutely. Okay? And I want to tell you that was the first wave civil rights movement. And what we can watch, it was like Luther. The first wave grace movement was Luther trying to center it. The second wave grace movement brought it way off center. We have to sin all the more so people will know that we don't believe in being saved by works. Okay? The second wave of almost any movement takes it way off the center. So the second wave of feminism. First wave of feminism, women are equal. Duh. Second wave of feminism, men are evil. They're oppressors. Okay? Now, is that God's design? Is that God's plan? No. Okay? So the first wave of civil rights movement, because the pendulum had been way over here, slavery and Jim Crow, first wave was content of the character, not the color of your skin. Second wave civil rights movement is going on right now. It's called things like critical race theory. It winds up saying that things like whites are evil. We all happen to be white here, are the problem. Right? Okay? So, I want to give you an example. At a teacher's training event in 2017, Ashley Shackelford famously or infamously said, quote, all white people are racist. You're always going to be racist, even when you're on the path to being a better person. I believe all white people are born into not being human and grow up into being demons. Unquote. Okay? I think we can start with the obvious. We all know, right, that whites have generally had advantages. We all know that blacks historically have been oppressed. We all know that we have blind spots and things to learn. Does anybody disagree with any of those? Okay? Sometimes when we're just swimming in this water, we don't see what we don't see. All we know is breathing water. Okay? But teaching first graders that because of the color of their skin, white, that they are evil, oppressing the world, that at worst is reverse racism, and at best, it's swinging the pendulum too far. Okay? So, we're going to figure out in some of the things that I'm going to do, and this is a good time to outline for you. Most weeks we're going to do a lot of discussion. Today, I'm going to do a lot of teaching. All right? Because if we don't get these foundations, we are going to talk past each other. Most weeks what we're going to do is I'm going to assign you a reading from the Benedict option, and then I am going to encourage you to do some listening to podcasts and other things. You can do it while you're doing the dishes or whatever, while you're driving back and forth to work. But what I'm going to invite you to do is listen to a few of the other authors of great books that we can cover later. Because right now we can't adequately cover one and ever get to another one quick enough. And so we're going to listen to a podcast by Vadi Bakum, who has written a book called Fault Lines. And what he does If the pendulum is swung too far here, this African-American pastor, who happens to be pastoring in Africa now, works at the polemical work of swinging the pendulum back to center. How do we get it off where it's stuck here and back to center? But his work is more polemical. How do we get it from there to here? And then we're also going to listen to John Perkins, who is going to talk about not how to swing it back, but how to center it in a gracious, loving, reconciling way that our culture's not good at all right now. Okay? Does that make sense? So we're going to be talking about some of those things. How many of you, if I ask you this question, how many of you agree with first wave civil rights? Judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Right? Everybody, right? How many are concerned with the second wave that essentially is saying right now the problem is whiteness? Okay? All right? So here's my heart in beginning to talk about this. And this goes to how do we discuss these things. Here's my heart. And I'm going to swing past the center for just a minute on purpose. All right? Martin Luther King was 50 years ago. And for many people, not enough has changed. And so we got to try something different. And we got to try something new. We've got to try something better. We've got to try something more radical. And in some ways, you can't blame people for wanting to force the change. Okay? And there are a lot of Christians that want to see this happen. And so I want to tell you, I love people who love justice. Okay? Why? They are arguably the most empathetic of all of us. They are passionate. They are chasing what is right and true. And they arguably grieve the most of any that are among us. Okay? They righteously hate racism. And they passionately want to get rid of the injustice. But with all this passion, they feel powerless to change the world. So, how do we change the world? If we can't do it in our little sphere of influence, the tendency and temptation of all of us is to go to the political. And we start seeking political solutions to where we're going. Okay? But where does the Benedict option point us? To the political? To the cultural? It points us to our neighborhoods, to our families, to our churches. Okay? Think of Jesus. Politically, was his world worse than ours? They were radically oppressed by the Romans. So what was Jesus' strategy? He came to earth to do what? To march to Rome, to overthrow them? Was that his strategy? No. His strategy was relationships. He talked to a few bigger groups, but mainly he met with 12 people. That was his strategy. And that needs to be our strategy. We love God. We love one another. We meet with a handful of people around us. And that needs to be our strategy. And it wound up changing the world. So much of the second wave of anything is lack of grace toward people who don't agree with you. Okay? If it's all white people in terms of critical race theory, Did anybody read this week that Tom Hanks got spanked in the media? He wrote this loving, wise, kind, first wave civil rights movement article about the justice and the need for Juneteenth, the new holiday. Okay? And here was the reaction on NPR. The commentator, I can't remember the commentator's name, essentially said, Tom Hanks is a nice non-racist who's made a career playing heroic white men, thus perpetuating white culture. He needs to become anti-racist because, and this is dualistic thinking, there's only two alternatives. If you're not anti-racist, you're racist. Okay? One of the great speakers for critical race theory is Ibram X. Kendi. I don't know if you've heard his name. He says, the most threatening racist movement in America today is not the alt-right and its white supremacists, but the average white person who wants a race-neutral environment. This is the roots of what is being proclaimed. Instead of content of the character, not the color of the skin, it is the average white person is the problem in America. Okay? Critical race theory, overly simplified, follows the political line of Marx, which means you can define all society in terms of the powerful and the oppressed. In Marx's day, it was the property owners, the oppressors, versus the workers, the oppressed. In terms of race, it is the whites, the oppressors, and the minorities who are oppressed. In terms of sexuality, it is the heteronormative who are the oppressors, and the LGBTQ movement who are the oppressed. In terms of philosophy, it is the Christians who are the oppressors, and it is the non-Christians who are the oppressed. In terms of intersectionality, I am at the lowest. I am a white, cisgendered, which means heteronormative, a white, cisgendered Christian male. I am the lowest of the low in intersectionality. So I ran into and so the solution of that, of course, is to awaken, to become woke to all of this. And to become such a way, if you are intersectionally in one of the lower, more oppressive people, is public repentance. And there are standards for that. Obviously, Tom Hanks now needs to publicly repent so that he can be popularly woke. We'll get back to questions in a minute. So, I ran into a teacher recently. And we just had a conversation. I said, I've seen you before. We've never had a chance to talk. I wanted to introduce myself. And we talked for a while. I found out that he had a graduating son who graduated now a month or so ago. And I said, great. What does your son want to do? He said, he wants to be a teacher. The teacher said, I'm telling him, don't be a teacher. Why? He said, because it's starting in California, but it's soon going to spread everywhere. In math. This guy's a math teacher. He said what they're teaching right now is that there are no right answers. Right answers, even in math, are oppressive. And so I'm telling my son, don't be a teacher. I said, I could tell what he thought of critical race theory from that comment, and I said, I'm glad you said that instead of me. He said, on the scale of intersectionality, I'm the lowest of the low. But because you are black, you have more credibility in being able to say, this wokeness is killing us. Okay? So, what do we do? If you're on the more woke side of this, don't label other people. It's demonic. The shaming is demonic. Okay? And if you go back to Adam and Eve in the garden, there was no shame when they were walking beside God. As soon as Satan entered the picture, they were shamed. And they had to cover everything up. Okay? So don't label other people. Assume the best of other people. Most may be blind to some cultural advantages, but most on the other side from you are non-racist. And yet we throw out that term like everybody's evil. And then work to draw together in the middle, which is the image of God and the content of our character. And if you are on the other side and you find someone who is woke, don't label them, because shaming is demonic. Assume the best of them. Some of them are the most compassionate of the people around us because their heart is aching for the brokenness and disadvantages in our world. And in relationship, work to craft the center, which is we are made in God's image, and we need to focus on the content of our character. Let me give you just a little suggestion. Anybody here like reading novels? I want to suggest a novel to you which has a spirit of joy connection. It is, everybody know Eric and Marilyn Kinberg? Their daughter just won the major young adult fiction award for Christian literature this past year for a book called The Means That Make Us Strangers. The Means That Make Us Strangers. It is an excellent book about racism. All right. Get my thing back closer to my mouth. Christine Kinberg's The Means That Make Us Strangers. Excellent book. That really focuses on the solution in a divided time in history, which was the 60s in South Carolina. And I won't give away any more than that. The solution was relationships with the people around you, okay? Which is very Benedictine option, very Christ-like. So we can keep going. There's back to all of this. Someone said, if we're going to talk about racial issues, we need to talk about how to start the work of reconciliation through the power of the gospel. And we can go through all of these issues. We have a disrespect for life. Everyone knows life is important to God. You can read it down there. And I'm going to move quickly here. And yet we have abortion, euthanasia, and a lack of care for the disabled in our world. Sexuality issues, we know what Genesis 1 and 2 say, and yet we're confused as a culture on sexuality. Failing schools that are around us. These are one of our people's words said, when I graduated from high school, America was first in education in the world, now we're 17th. That's an issue on all kinds of levels, okay? Failing churches and declining faith. It's a lack of the proclamation of the truth. All the way through, you can read this. And eventually online, I'm going to put in, I get to go back to video editing. And I'm going to put in some of these things so that you can see some of these. But it's that sense of, we have churches that are failing. And so you can read, you know that there's a biblical foundation behind all of these. Does God want failing churches? No. Christians in politics, there are a few of here that are kind of interesting. Jesus' climate, the worldview was worse than ours. He didn't confront politics. He created change by speaking truth and forging relationships. But here's what we're saying about Christians in politics. Too many, even Christians, are looking to government to solve more issues. Okay? We're looking to government, not to God. We think that if we just vote right this one time, things will change. We're thinking for politics again. Many vocal conservative Christians supported support of Donald Trump ruined the Christian witness among many millennials. Okay? Many could not stand Trump. And if that's what Christians stood for, then we were not going to. We can't abide by what the church does. That said, statistically, the liberal church is much more active in politics than the conservative church nowadays. Okay? We remember the days of the moral majority, so-called, and yet it's now the liberal church. Poverty, God's heart for the poor is obviously central, and poor stewardship of the economy, inflation, creating disadvantages hurt the poor the most. It's a form of oppression. I'll do some of these other icons. I was going to do one there, but I want to allow a little bit of time for questions. But both, actually let me do this. Poverty and immigration are issues where we both kind of know where God stands. God cares for all people. Rich, poor, he cares for the disadvantaged. In fact, if you read particularly the Gospel of Luke, God's heart for the poor is powerful. All right? And yet, how do we respond to those? When I was a 20-year-old, young and idealistic, I thought Jimmy Carter was the best president ever. All right? And it could be argued that in terms of character, looking what he did after his presidency, starting things like Habitat for Humanity and tangibly caring for the poor, it could be argued that he had the most character of any of our presidents in recent memory. Okay? And therefore, I hated Reagan. Hated Reagan. I became an editorial cartoonist at my campus paper at North Carolina State University. I got really good, and you can look at the picture on the back, I got really good at drawing Ronald Reagan because I hated the man. And so I got really good at drawing Reagan. But you know, by the end of the 80s, through Reagan's time, the poor, which was one of my major issues at the time, the poor were way better off under Reagan, who everybody said hated the poor, than they were under Carter, who wound up with inflation and all kinds of things. And here, both with poverty and immigration, I just want to say very simply that as Christians, we need to learn what our foundation is. If my concern is for the poor and your concern is for the poor and you advocate for this and I advocate for that, aren't we on the same team? Okay? It's not about politics. It's about what we're called to do. And if I work for the poor doing this and you work for the poor doing that, who cares? We're still working for the poor. But it's our politics that divides us so much. Immigration is one of those issues. Where the last funeral I did was with an immigrant. The last cup of coffee I had was essentially with an immigrant. I don't think any of us is opposed to immigration. Now, we can debate how and the legality and all of that, but don't we all care for all people because they're God's people? That's the place where, okay, we can debate policy. And we used to be able to do that in the 80s when I was a kid. We can't do that anymore. We call the other side evil. All right? So you can look at all of these, the rest of the list there. This is your list. But I'm going to go back to the book just real quick. We're going to leave a few minutes for, and I know some of you have kids here and you're got to get back to them, but I want to finish with where we're at. Key question. This is Rod Dreher's words. Are we going to be content to be the chaplaincy of a consumerist or all the other problems culture? I would say a dying culture. Is the church going to be content to be the chaplaincy of a dying culture that is fast losing a sense of what it means to be Christian? Anybody content to just be chaplains to a dying culture? The alternative, and these are Rod Dreher's words, is a strategic withdrawal from culture. Dreher read, and he'll tell you this in the introduction, Alistair MacIntyre, and he began calling for a strategic withdrawal prophesied by MacIntyre called the Benedict option. We do what Benedict did. We create little communities in our neighborhoods, in our families, that focus on what God does. And we wait for the world to say there's something different and better there. Okay? We've already lost the culture war. Just fighting it is not where he wants us to expend our energy. Where he wants us fighting is in our neighborhoods and making differences in the lives of people around us. Okay? He says if we want to survive, we have to return to the roots of our faith, both in thought and in practice. We are going to have to learn habits of the heart forgotten by believers in the West. We are going to have to change our lives and our approach to life in radical ways. In short, we are going to have to be the church without compromise, no matter what it costs. He says in the first half of this book, which is what we're going to be reading the next week or two, he says, I will define the challenge of post-Christian America as I see it. I'm going to cover the philosophical and theological roots of our society's fragmentation. That's what we're going to do next week, okay? We're going to read in chapter 2, I promise you it's going to be the hardest in the entire book, but philosophically, how did we get to where we are? And if you're not a philosopher, you're going to curse me and Rod Dreher, because it is long and dry, and it's like, why does this matter? But if we don't know how we got here, we don't know how to fix it, okay? In the second part, and this is the fun part of the book, I will discuss how the way of Christian living prescribed by the rule of St. Benedict can be adapted to the lives of modern Christians of all churches and confessions. All right, and I want you to look just real quick. There's a quote under the picture of the world, the flesh, and the devil. If you don't know, all of us have a three-pronged attack against us. Our flesh wants to do what the flesh wants to do. If you read my devotion from this week, Woody Allen, when he got caught in an affair with his teenage adopted daughter, just shrugged and said, the flesh wants what the flesh wants. As if that was a good excuse. We know that it's sometimes true. How many of you have ever given in to the flesh? Okay? But our flesh tempts us, and then the world and Satan lie to us, trying to make us think it's okay. Okay? That's the world that we live in. Right under that picture that says the world, the flesh, and the devil. And by the way, it's such a common phrase. It comes from Ephesians 2. I won't read that to you right now. But there was a movie in the 50s called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil. Here's the simple premise of the movie. Somehow, maybe it was nuclear war, because in the 50s everybody was afraid of nuclear war. Everybody on Earth died, except Sidney Poitier's, Harry Belafonte's character. Harry Belafonte's character survived. He was a miner. He was deep in a mine. He didn't get infected and irradiated. he made his way, only man in the world, to New York City, where he happened to run into, black character, a white woman. They became fast friends. They were together in this battle. And then, somehow into port in New York City, sailed Mel Ferrer, who played the white character, and now suddenly there was a triangle, and who was the bad man? It was the black man. And so it was a social commentary movie from the 50s that was actually really good, from what I heard. I never saw it. But I want you to listen to this phrase. I put this underneath the world, the flesh, and the devil. This book does not offer a political agenda, nor is it a spiritual how-to manual, nor a standard decline and fall of the Western Hemisphere lament. True, it does offer a critique of modern culture from a traditional Christian viewpoint. And I will explore the philosophical and theological roots of our society's fragmentation. But, most importantly, it tells the stories of traditional Christians who are pioneering creative ways to live out the faith joyfully and counterculturally in these darkening days. My hope is that you will be inspired by them and collaborate with like-minded Christians in your local area to construct responses to the real-world challenges faced by the church. If the salt is not to lose its savor, we have to act. The hour is late. This is not a drill. See the salt shaker on the icons on the one side? I was talking to Cyrus Gakori, who, by the way, is going to preach on Sunday. Cyrus, if you don't know, he came here as a pastor from Kenya, went to seminary for more years, just graduated. And Cyrus was saying, one of my pastors in Kenya always used to tell us that we are to be salt and light. But as long as salt is in the salt shaker, it does no good. Essentially, we have to get out of the box. Okay? So, I got more I can say, but that was longer than I intended to go, and I figured it would be. But I figured if we're not on the same page and realize that we've got to start with a worldview and move toward relationships in our neighborhoods and whatever, we're going to keep talking about politics, and we're never going to get to go where we need to go. All right? And so if anyone, including me, goes to politics or dwells too much on culture, say, wait a minute, go back to the worldview. What is the worldview behind it? What does God say? And how do you turn it into local action? How do you get out of the salt shaker? Make sense? Okay, so questions. I've talked for forever, and if you need to go, just bug out. I've got at least an hour because the mission team, a couple of us are driving the mission team vans back tonight. And so if you have to go, get out of here. That is more than fine with me. But I'm probably here for another hour, so you can ask me questions until you're the only one left and are bored and exhausted. Responses, what do you think?
After you brought up quite a distance in your discussion, but it all seems very hopeless.
Okay.
All of these things that people cited in emails to you and you categorize as sixes and fours, etc. I can point to 10 or 20 times in the 50s, the 60s, and the 20s when all that was still happening.
Mm-hmm.
One of the basic differences today is that we had
Mm-hmm.
Today, everybody's their own media. This internet world out there with hundreds of thousands of people telling you what the truth is.
Yep.
It's different. And, you know, there are a lot of us out here that are born-again Christians that really care. And that doesn't come from...
Hold on a second. For those listening at home, I'm going to translate the question here in just a minute because I know you can't hear it. So you'll get to hear it in a minute. So keep going.
Well, I'm rambling, so forgive me. But of those that are blessed with that relationship, a lot of those don't know how to communicate. For example, my daughter, I believe, is a born-again Christian.
Mm-hmm.
She's dogmatic.
Yep.
And she tries to force things down people's throat, whether it be political or Christian or whatever. I was talking to a friend the other day who's having trouble with his marriage. And he's a born-again Christian. He's been to the seminary. But he's dogmatic. And he's describing this argument with his wife. He says, and I tell her this thing over and over again in a conversation. And I tell her for the third time, and then I really get angry and I lose it. And I said, if you told her 3 times, you told her too damn many times. She ain't gonna get it if she didn't get it the second time. You need to shut up. The point is, it just seems so hopeless.
Yep.
I get that we individually have to do our part. We have to try to serve others. It's a relationship at its core. But there ain't many of us. And those that there are don't seem to know how. A lot of us don't seem to know how. And I get that education's a part of that. But so many just aren't even capable of getting past themselves. It's just so low.
Yep. Okay, so the question, or it was as much a comment as a question, and it just seems so hopeless. Even those who want to communicate part of the message are not skilled at it. Sometimes, in your experience, they're too dogmatic. They come across as, you've got to do this. And I always look back to the model of Christ. Okay. I don't know about you, but I can't be Christ.
Yes, I get that we could be Martin Luther or Martin Luther King or
Yep.
one of those.
Yep.
You're right, we can't be the Son of God.
But if we look at Christ, the irony was that Jesus usually sharpened the law instead of softened the law. And most people forget that because he was so loving. And part of his reason for sharpening the law was evangelistic. It was to show us that we can't save ourselves. We need something other than works, because that's not going to do it. And so he would sharpen the law, but then they would find love. The woman at the well. He didn't say, you've had a checkered past, what's the big deal? He let her acknowledge that she'd sinned and fall short. And yet in love, then he offered her living water. And it's hard. And it's trying to walk, I call it a tightrope. Bill Fleming has an image. Most of you know Bill Fleming. He uses it when we're trying to walk that tightrope. He says, you know, everybody has one of the poles to help them balance. And many of us try and hold a pole that's this long, okay? He says, if we want to balance, the longer the pole, the better. And we need to stretch toward truth. And that's one of the icons on the back is word and grace. That's how I describe who Lutherans are. We've got to stretch even more toward the word, not in a dogmatic sense, but that if we don't stand for something, we're going to fall for anything. But then we need to be radical in our grace. Okay? Mary Louise and Tracy up here helped start a young adults group in the past year. And some of those young people are living pretty messy lives. Sometimes you start with the grace to get them to the Word. Sometimes you wake them up with the Word to convict them that they need the grace. In terms of hopelessness, I'm sure Benedict thought it was hopeless. He went off and lived in a cave. And we can choose to do that. I'll dig a hole in my backyard for you if you... With the chickens, yes. You can. But we all get that way sometimes. I bet most of us at some point or another have thought it's hopeless, haven't we? What are we ever going to do? This is not going to get better. How many of you ever turned to the news hoping to find something that turns the tide? That's why I turn to the news every day, because I want to turn the tide. I want things to get better. And if just someone says the right thing, then the rest of the world will wake up and it'll all make sense. Roger says that's not going to happen. We've lost the culture. One of my favorite phrases that he says is that Christ promised that the gates of hell will never prevail against his church. But he didn't say the gates of hell won't prevail against the church in the West. Okay? We are that final hope, even when it feels hopeless. And to the best of our ability, and maybe it's as a community, we have to figure out what this is. Further chapters will come across things, and you're going to read them because he's going to have a chapter on you need to homeschool your kids or start a Christian school. And many of you are looking at, my kids are gone, they're all grown up, me start a Christian school, are you kidding me? But what can a church do? Okay?
You look at Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And he resisted, and he did it well in a Christian fashion, orderly fashion. But at the end of the day, he lost. Now,
He died, but he didn't lose.
he left a legacy, I'll grant you.
Yep.
But he died in prison, and as far as his life went,
But you're saying the other churches, the churches didn't take any action. He was out there
he was
on his
out
own.
there by himself. And the
Yep.
other thing that saved us from Nazi Germany was the fact that America seemed to be genuinely on the right side.
Mm-hmm.
And now,
But he proclaimed truth, and that truth was what was needed after the war. It didn't change everything during the war. But after the war, the story of Corrie ten Boom. After the war, it was the truth that put some people's feet back on firm ground.
And Jesus won by being crucified.
Isn't that interesting? Jesus won by being crucified. Seat of the church, it's the blood of the martyrs. Let's go to Matt, and then were you raising your hand maybe too, Tracy?
So, just to piggyback off that, it feels hopeless sentence. What would you say, obviously without getting into all the details that Dreher is going to lead us into just yet, but as a preview, what would you say are the expectations that he's trying to set for us to have hope as we move forward? What's victory look like in the present time? What's the hope of preserving victory, maybe is even the better way to ask it,
Mm-hmm.
look like?
Mhm. It looks different in every neighborhood. It looks different in every church. We have groups of people around here. Let's say, I mentioned maybe we start a Christian school. So the question was, what does this look like? What if we started a Christian school? And the 5 of you said, you know what, we catch that vision, we're going to go start a Christian school. Ed says, I don't want to teach, but I'll help you build it. But everyone's going to play a role. Whole church can do this. But these 2 say, we're going to start a group for 20-year-olds. And even if one person comes out of there stronger, and I've known at least one that's changed in major ways, and I know at least another one that's found major hope, and you can tell me more stories. But that's where we're going to make our difference. You may say, we're going to start Bible study in our neighborhood and our prayer group, and we're going to make a difference with them. Desi, I know you and another friend at church have a friend who's dealing with somebody who's dying in their family. And for a million reasons, that person can't believe fully in God right now. What if in our own little way we make a difference? Okay? Yeah. Linda, you have some great grandkids that are growing up with challenges, and maybe, Christian school, maybe you can't start a Christian school, but maybe you can work with one so that my great-grandkids have a place to go. And Kenny, you're doing it week after week as your family homeschools children and often helps teach many other children in the process. We could go around this whole group and say, what does it look like? I can't tell you. But if we all go forward and say, you know what, it does feel hopeless. But if we reach one person, that's not hopeless. We have made a difference. We had when I first came here, we hired some youth and family ministers, and they were really good. They left because she got cancer a couple of years later. It was minor cancer, but it was enough for her as a young mom to say, I want to get back to my family. And so they moved back. But I remember him telling the story of his grandpa being a missionary. And his grandpa was always a crusty kind of guy. And why this crusty old guy wanted to be a missionary, mainly he wanted to make an impact on the kingdom. But he was a crusty old guy. They were down in Cuba before Castro came into power. And he said, you'd go and talk to Grandpa, and Grandpa would spend the first hour complaining. Spent 15 years down there. All I know is I impacted one person. And he just complained. All that time, all that effort, nothing went forward, nothing good happened. It was just... And then an hour later, when he's talking about other things and he's got all the crustiness out of him, he says, but Alma, or whatever her name was that we impacted, she's leading churches all over Cuba right now. It's like, come on, Grandpa. He's like, you impacted one person. She impacted hundreds, which means you impacted hundreds. Don't you get it? So
I just wanted to add to what you had asked, because I've read this book a couple times, is that the second half of the book, it actually gives very practical things that we as Christians can do, as a community of Christians can do, that do have an effect on our community, on our families. And so it's really different people, you kind of follow those different people and what they've done
Yeah, and so Marilyn,
So there is,
they're saying here,
definitely is hope.
for our folks listening at home, isn't that what the commentators say? For our folks listening at home, it was a reaffirmation that the second half of the book is very practical. And right now, maybe the place to say is, I just outlined the flood. And you're coming to me going, oh my goodness, I never thought this would happen. What do we do? I mean, my house is upside down. I'm never going to be able to move back in. All of my property is destroyed. What am I going to do? And all I can tell you is, hey, Ed, we're going to serve you jambalaya. Anybody who wants to make jambalaya one week, I'm all for it. Ruth.
You said earlier when you're balancing, you need to stretch out towards the truth, which of course is Scripture.
Uh-huh.
And what we learn there is Jesus is our hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
So things are only hopeless when Jesus is left out.
Very good.
So if we have Jesus in there with us, which is what this is all about, it's not hopeless. There is hope.
If Jesus is our hope, we're only hopeless if we don't count on him. Tracy. Good. All right, Ruth just said it all for Tracy. And then she forgot it, so we may come back. Kathy.
That's right. I was just thinking as you were talking about Dreher's more recent book, Live Not by Lies, and I know
Yes.
you talked about that in a sermon. And when I read that book, if I sum that up in one sentence, it's don't say anything that isn't true.
Okay.
And everybody can do that.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
and I mean, the example that I give to people is I will not call Caitlyn Jenner she because Caitlyn is he.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true that he is a she.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, just simple things like that. You know, I just don't say things that aren't true.
I debated which book to start with, and I mentioned several weeks ago in a sermon Rod Dreher's newest book, which is Live Not by Lies, which is a phrase taken from a speech or a paper that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a communist dissident in Russia in the 80s, I guess it was, 70s and 80s. And he essentially taught people, and this was Kathy's one-sentence summary of the book, Live Not by Lies, if all you do is not speak lies, you've made a difference. Okay? I just won't repeat them. Because how many of you know, and you probably did this maybe in college, the professor wants you to say a certain thing his way. And so you're like, okay, so I can get the grade, I'm just going to say that. But you say it enough times and you start to believe it. Don't say lies. Focus on the truth.
In which case then you need to recognize truth.
You mean we need to recognize that truth? So how do we recognize the truth? We've got to focus more on the word than less. So exactly right. Exactly.
I did remember what it had to do with the whole hope thing. Because we're bombarded with bad news, because evidently that's what sells, it is very easy to see the hopeless side of things.
Yep.
A number of years ago, I was walking in a Sam's parking lot with my mom. I have a tendency not to lock my car. But when I'm with my parents, and especially in a big lot like that, I'll lock it. And we were talking about this, because she asked, did you lock the car? Yes, I locked the car. But I looked around this huge parking lot, and it hit me how rarely cars are broken into. In these places that are more volatile places like mall parking lot, that overall, in the grand scheme of things, percentage-wise, there's more good that happens in those parking lots in terms of more cars are not broken into than are broken into.
Mm-hmm.
And I reflected on that goodness that we see, and this goes to worldview.
Yep.
Because in my worldview, everything good comes from the Father.
Okay. Yep.
So everything good that I see in this world influenced by God. And so focusing on the good, that the very fact that there are good things that happen in this world gives me hope.
Okay.
Because that's evidence of God at work in the world.
And Tracy's essentially saying we can look around and see all of the bad, but we usually overinflate that because there tends to be more, and more of the good eventually is a reflection of God. It's woven into everyone's heart. We're all made in God's image. Now, we may not follow him, but it's there. It's there. And so as we do that, one of the reasons that there's so much anxiety in our world today is that the media is international. If someone falls in Cambodia, I can hear about it instantly. Okay? If a bus crashes. It used to be when the news was more local, I wouldn't hear what was going on unless it was huge. And then only 4 days later, I wouldn't hear it. But now we hear it instantly. And if it bleeds, it leads. And so we're meant to hear that our world's worse than it really is.
The Saturday night wrestling mentality of the news media.
Yes.
It's sensational, so.
Yep. So Penny said it's the Saturday Night Wrestling mentality that draws viewers. And then Ed pointed out that Saturday Night Wrestling is fake, like much of our news.
Pastor Ed?
Yes.
One thing that's striking me is, I've listened to all of what you said. You started out talking about we have to get the foundation.
Yep.
And, but the answers, the practical things, are what we've always been called to do, which is foundational.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Okay.
loving others through various different acts.
Yes.
Locally, our neighbors, our families, our communities. So it's nothing new, it's refocusing. Focus off of the media.
Yeah.
Learn how to turn it off or hear only, little bits of it, just so you understand what's going on with the world.
Mm-hmm.
But stay, refocus onto the foundational basics of what we're called to do. And so and I also feel kind of like we're in a bunker mentality, or that we might be the remnant
Yes.
when this is all over. And we have to have a remnant,
Mm-hmm.
somebody has to live through this.
I think that actually is why it's called the Benedict option, because we're not meaning to. Benedict, that is what he did. In that by starting the monastery, he created the right atmosphere and place to preserve civilization, Christian civilization. And he did preserve Christian civilization so that it was passed on in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is the whole point of this, is that instead of us focusing on changing the culture and politics, let's position our churches in a way to actually conserve what Christ has given us first, of first importance. Let's preserve the gospel in its truest form, in its historic form, and the acts which he's called us to, his commands, and let that thrive in this place, and let God to bring others to it. And hopefully
So the solution.
Because kind of a question that falls onto that, is it not so much about saving souls anymore? Because we've lost the culture war.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't say that it isn't.
Right.
But I'm saying, is it, in our doing our loving to each other and reaching out in our communities, that happens.
It's still about evangelism.
Yeah,
It's just, it's still, that doesn't change, because eventually, if we're doing what Christ calls us to, we will be attractive. People will come.
So the basic summary, my summary of all of this is we're not being called to something new. being called to something old and foundational, which is simply loving God and loving our neighbor. And the changes that occur, which is essentially what Benedict did, he did something old and tried and true, and it wound up changing culture. And will change culture, will rescue lives if individuals and churches just simply do the old better instead of focusing on, oh, we just got a new strategy. No, it's like we need to be more authentically the church. It's not all the other stuff. It's we need to be more authentically who we are. So, now.
So that sounds like one of the questions we would be needing to ask ourselves then is, where have we lost track of who we were supposed to be? Like, it's going to require some humility. I think even what they were saying all around with, like, the analogy of Saturday Night Wrestling being the pattern for news media.
Yeah.
Sensational sells. Well, why are we watching the news anymore? We
Right.
think it's because we're trying to be informed, but the world has subtly led us into it being so that we are entertained,
Right.
right? And so if we can humbly address those kinds of things and say, why am I still doing this? Is there still a reason, therefore, to do it?
Mm-hmm.
And how does that allow me to relate to my neighbors? Okay, I will watch the news so that I know what my neighbors are talking about, so that I can engage them, but that allows me to redirect my life back to the foundation and to loving my neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so part of the question was, and the part that really grabbed me is, where did we go off track? And I can speak to that as a pastor. When kind of throughout my ministry, as I was a young pastor, the whole seeker-sensitive movement was coming up. And as mega churches started forming, there was an unspoken rule within the church that the bigger your church, as a pastor, the better a person you were. Okay? And so it's not as hard as it seems to grow a big church. You know, so what do you do if you want to grow a bigger church? You simply do things like you make sure you have the most dynamic past preacher you have. You create messages that are, instead of working your way through Scripture in which you deal with the hard things and the fun things and the bad things and the complicated things, no, it's like how to fix your marriage, how to raise your kids, and it becomes all about you. And it's a very self-oriented focus within the church. You get the best band that you can, because that's entertainment. And so what you're doing is you're creating entertainment and you're giving people messages that are all about the self. And to me, watching over these last, my first job in the church was almost 40 years ago. I was 19 at the time, but it was almost 40 years ago. Church has changed a lot in that time. And in America, that's a place that went off track. Now, we also follow Europe, where Europe went off track, was essentially philosophically, because Europe's philosophy in the 20th century was things are getting better. It was a modernist outlook philosophically. It didn't derive from Darwin, but Darwin fit into that. It was evolution. We're evolutionarily getting better. Whether people were Christian evolutionists or not, we are getting better. And then 2 world wars happened. And the meshing of the church with that wrong philosophy. 15 years ago, we went over to Germany to do an evangelism mission trip because Germany's the land of Luther. People don't go to church in Germany anymore. The Germans were polite, but they had no interest in talking to us. The Turkish immigrants did. But Germany was post-Christian. We are moving toward post-Christian philosophically, because we have, and Roger will talk about that next week, it's a different set of issues that we have. But the church has undercut itself when it was about entertainment and stuff.
You know, it seems to me too that the church has kind of watered down, overall, watered down God. It's no longer about the Spirit of God and how powerful He is, and it's more like, what can God do for you?
Yep. What can God do for you?
Yeah, and that, I don't want to say that handcuffs God, because I don't, He can't be handcuffed, but I think it dampens what people are looking for
Mm-hmm.
in God.
Mm-hmm. Culture has lied to us. Too much in the church has lied to us.
That's why we're here, is because it's not that way.
Mm-hmm. And our goal is, I think that's Roger's whole point, how do we become the church again? More authentically the church. It's not giving up on culture. It's not giving up on rescuing people. It's that the only way to rescue the people is to truly be the church. So, Kathy and then Ruth.
Have you heard the term narcigesis? We know what exegesis is.
Okay.
Narcigesis is putting us into the text.
Huh.
And I was just, there's a YouTube channel that my lady she claims out of, I think, Wiccan. And she's been in seminary and she does these apologetic videos.
Mm-hmm.
And, she started talking about this. And like one of the clips she showed was of a pastor who I had seen.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something about the sermon that had bothered me, but I couldn't lay my finger on it. Well, this is what it was. It was so what you were talking about is, these things, how to do this, all this self-help in the church. That can be narcigesis.
Yeah. Yeah. Exegesis means you're trying to extract from the scriptures what it says. But I like that term narcigesis because it's narcissistic way of reading it.
And you're applying everything to yourself. And
Yeah.
not every story in the Bible has to do with me.
Yeah. And there is a teaching in Scripture, in circles today, that really undermines the authority of Scripture. And I encountered a piece of it after being away from a church, the first church that I was in for about 15 years. Mary Louise and I went back and we visited. Their new pastor, one of the nicest people that you will ever want to meet. But I noticed when she was preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, she never said Jesus said. She always said Matthew said. Okay? It's a subtle shift. Matthew did write it down. But in saying Matthew said instead of Jesus said, what she was saying was this was a human word by a human person. And the conclusion eventually gets to, well, if the Spirit could speak to that human then the Spirit, two truths and a lie, then the Spirit can speak through me now, and I have the authority to determine what's right and wrong. That's the two truths and a lie. Spirit spoke to Matthew then, the Spirit speaks to me now, two truths. The lie is the conclusion is therefore I can determine what's right there. So, Ken.
Well, it's kind of as you're talking, it's all inverted, right? We've taken, the idea of, I'm responsible for my actions. We've externalized that. And other people are responsible for my circumstances. And conversely, we've taken that the truth is outside of me. And we said, well, now the truth is in me. It's like we flip the script.
Mm-hmm.
And, the secret system did the same thing. The truth of how to grow the church is in us as opposed to comes from God. He told us how to grow the church.
Mm-hmm.
And every time we invert it,
Yeah, part of my assignment for next week to you. This is a great books club. I'm not going to make you read Carl Truman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self before next week. Kathy, you've read it. It took 6 weeks, and Kathy is a reader that
I usually read
a book a week.
Yeah.
This one is. I'm in a small group with David Roberts from our church, who is a philosophy professor. I've said, David, I'm going to work at reading this, but you've got to tell me what it means. It is a dense book, but it's a powerful book. It is all the philosophical underpinnings for where we are in our culture right now. Okay? And how did we get here? The rise and triumph of the modern self. I sent you all an email link to a podcast from his. Because if he's doing it Question and Answer and he's talking in a short, he's compacting his whole book down to a little bit. But it's one of those that if you're like, man, I want to understand this, it's an example of where you can go.
Actually, Pastor Ed, I went through it twice. I read it and I listened to it on tape.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I still don't.
Yeah.
That's an honest. There's a lot of people, I just realized he mentioned McIntyre in here.
Yeah.
Truman goes in, talks about McIntyre a lot.
Yes. As well as Charles Taylor and
Charles Taylor, who wrote A Secular Age.
yeah, and Reith, isn't it? Is his other third.
Yeah, well,
Primary.
A Secular Age is this thick and it's on my desk right now. So,
Yeah.
it's on my desk. My husband got that book years ago off of one of those $2 tables that they stick outside because they hope that people will steal them so they don't have to deal with them anymore.
Yeah.
But my husband stopped at the $2 table and got this, and he has read parts of it and said, "Oh, we need to read this." Well, I have a stack
Yeah.
of books.
Yeah.
It's a sickness. It really is.
I'm hoping if we go to the rise and triumph of the modern self, we can let Dave come in and teach that segment. Because you don't want to hear my interpretation, which would be sophomoric compared to doctoral. So, all right, so I have sent you the assignment for next week. I need to get Kate's email address. I have everybody else's. Desi, yours might have bounced back. Have you been getting emails from me? Text me your, you got emails from me? Okay. What's that? Very good. Very good. Okay. So if you're not getting emails from me, it'll be harder to find what you're doing next week. So email me, but if Alan, you can text me Kate's email, I will make sure I get that to her. So, Desi, I know you've got a book. You got a book. You do too. Good.
thank you, guys.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's going to be good when we get to the practical stuff. This week was just, we're ready to run off to a cave. The floodwaters have come. We're ready to run off to a cave. But the good news is we get jambalaya. So, all right. Let me go hit the stop button and then I will, I'll just hit.